Welcome to Wortley Hall Walled Garden again. I'll show you some other aspects of the garden this time. This is the orchard area, which is where most of the fruit that we grow is situated. And this is a walled garden, as the name suggests, but as well as the walls which are external to the garden and protect the garden from the outside world, there's an intermediate wall as well. This wall here is one of the intermediate walls. It's hollow, so inside here there's sort of like shelves inside it, which act pretty much like flues, and that would enable the heat from the fires which are on the other side of the wall to move the heat backwards and forwards along the wall so it reaches the top. Not something we've ever used, not likely to, and from the look of it wasn't used much in the past either, but it would have been good for late winter, early spring, when you've got fruit trees like peaches, maybe nectarines. They flower in about February. You can imagine it'd be very cold here in February, air frosts. So having a fire and heating the wall, perhaps with some hessian sacking hanging down over the front as well, would have protected the blossoms from frost damage. The altitude of this garden is about 750 feet above sea level, so it's prone to being cold here most of the year. The growing season's relatively short for the region we're in South Yorkshire because of the altitude. So having this wall, which is southeast facing, gives us an advantage in terms of growing slightly more tender plants. So to grow pears in this part of the world is a little bit of a challenge, but you're more likely to get success in terms of good quality ripe fruit by growing on a south-facing aspect wall like this. So when we came to restoring the garden, we thought a nice touch, a little taste of the past, a bit of the appearance of how the garden had been like in the past, would be to train pear trees on this south-facing wall to an espalier form. Espalier, I believe, being French for a shoulder. So you can see how this is multiple espaliers here, where you train a main stem, a leader, all the way to the top of the wall, and then you train off branches, laterals, growing off at an angle to it on the horizontal. This is a restricted form of growing, which enables you to grow a fruit tree against a wall or on a post and wire, some kind of fence as well. It maximises the space you've got. You've got a fruit tree against a structure rather than a free-standing bush. And the added advantage is that you've got lots of light penetration to the tree because you haven't got lots of branches shading out each other as a bush tree would be. So this does tend to mean that the fruit that's on these branches here gets more light and air around them than otherwise. Light's good for quality of fruit, the flavour, because of the ripening process is enhanced by extra sunlight, and air helps reduce the potential incidence of disease, especially fungal infections, by having good airflow around them. So we trained these ones ourselves. They came as maiden whips, so a year-old tree would have been about that high, just a little stick basically, and a few roots on it, and we've trained them up from there. It's a tier a year, so 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4, 5, 6, 7, and they're about 9 years old now. And you can see they're in production. There's a good set of fruit on this tree this year actually. This one is Merton Pride, which was developed at the John Innes Institute in South London, in Merton. So perhaps would normally be a southern variety, but as you can see, on a southeast facing aspect wall in South Yorkshire, it actually does really, really well. So this is the beginning of the apple orchard. These are established trees now. We planted them in 2009. So they're mature now and they're in production, though the odd tree, like this one, is having a year off. Quite a few apple trees are prone to doing that. They'll have a year where they fruit very heavily and a year off, and then they fruit heavily the following year, hopefully. Most of the 2 rows down here are Yorkshire heritage varieties, which we sourced from a member of the Northern Fruit Group, and we thought we'd have the collection here. So there's 17 different Yorkshire varieties, and we've got them all here. This one here is green balsam. This one here is Syke House russet. Syke House, I think, is famous as the longest village in England because it follows along the canal there. That has lovely, very small fruits, but they're very tasty russet type apple. We think the original name for that was English Hospital Rainette, which suggests its origin is from France. Why it's English Hospital Rainette, we don't know, but a lot of hospitals used to have kitchen gardens in them, so maybe it links to that. Then we have Hunt House. Hunt House originates from North Yorkshire, probably around the Whitby area. Rumour has it this is the apple that Captain Cook used to take on board his ships for his expeditions because it's a long keeper. But whether that's factually correct, no one knows. But it's a very nice, quite early apple that you can either cook or allow to ripen a bit more on the tree and eat as a dessert apple. It's very ribbed, quite distinctive shape to it as it gets bigger. It's got these ribs round it, which is a bit unusual. And then further along, mind your head, we've got Yorkshire Cockpit. This most years produces very, very heavily. It's had a huge crop last year, so this year it's got a rather modest crop on it. It's quite a sharp apple, which generally is thought of as being a cooker, but actually we've marketed it as a dessert apple and no one's complained because it's actually quite tasty if you like an apple with a little bit of an acid sharpness to it. I think what's true of many of the old apple varieties that used to be grown around farmhouses for storage because you couldn't go to the supermarket and buy an apple. So lots of apples around that era were bred to be what you call dual purpose. So they can be cooked early on and then in storage they mellow a bit, the sugars build, and you can eat them as a dessert apple through the winter time. So that's Yorkshire Cockpit. This tree here is Nancy Jackson, which is a bit like a Bramley apple, a bit like a Bramley seedling rather, a cooking apple and a long keeper. So you could store that from a September, October picking and it might last through till January, February in storage. Then we have Charleston Pippin. There's a fruit there. These will ripen to yellow. They'll actually look like a Golden Delicious when they're ripe, but they taste a bit different from Golden Delicious. They're sweet though, a bit like that. There must be some similar shared genetics in the different varieties. Charleston I think is somewhere between Wakefield and Doncaster, which is actually with the magnesium limestone bedrock you get in that region of Yorkshire, very good for apple growing actually. So that's an interesting variety, in fact, it's quite tasty. Then we have a very distinctive apple here. This one's Grandpa Buxton, which grows quite large. These will get much bigger than that still. Will be quite yellow eventually. There's a good cooking apple. Now, it's a Yorkshire variety. It was bred in the 1990s, so it's not exactly heritage, but it's from Pickering in North Yorkshire. And then along here we have Flower of the Town. Again, another tree that's having a holiday this year. It's on furlough, I think. This one has normally got fruits which are a bit ribbed and green with lots of red stripes on it, and tastes really awful. But it's supposed to be a really good cider apple, and that's how we try to market it in the past. Is it's good for making cider because I can't recommend it as a dessert apple. It's not that great a cooker because they're quite small and ribbed, so they're quite hard to peel. So that must be what they're originally for, was for cider making. This one here is a very sharp tasting cooking apple, so it makes a really good apple sauce. It's got a very long snout at the end, so it's called dog snout. There's actually another old English variety called pig snout. I don't know how much they're synonymous with each other, but this is dog snout, which is well-known Yorkshire variety. This will turn yellow with sort of some red coloration on it as well. But that's got a big crop this year and looking very healthy. Then we have a russet apple. This one's called Acklam russet. It tastes dry and astringent, so I don't like it at all, but some people must like it. We do sell it, some people like it, but what's noticeable about it is that it produces fruit every year and it's never had any sign of disease. So its good point is it's pretty much a bulletproof tree, but the fruit to me isn't particularly interesting, but it's obviously got some heritage value to it anyway. Then we have Yorkshire greening, which is, again, is a cooking apple that makes an exceptionally good quality puree. Doesn't need sugar or sweetening. It's got such rich flavour to it. Its other name traditionally in Yorkshire is goose sauce, Yorkshire goose sauce, which you can make up your own mind about how that might relate to the use of this apple. And then we have Charlestown pippin. So I know I mentioned earlier on, if you were listening carefully, Charleston pippin. This one's Charlestown pippin. They're almost identical apples, so I don't know if that's because people's hearing and Chinese whispers and that kind of thing, but it's a very, very similar apple. So my suspicions are it's not that different, but we don't know. They've been listed separately, I've checked it out, and this is also a yellow-skinned, quite sweet, soft-fleshed dessert apple, very good quality. And then finally on the end here, the last Yorkshire apples that I've got along these rows here is Fillingham pippin. Fillingham, I believe, is also somewhere in Yorkshire. Last year had a huge crop on it. They're quite small apples. Generally speaking, again, they're like a dual purpose. So you can cook with them. If you allow them to mellow a bit in storage, they do become an acceptable dessert eating apple. And then we've got Ribston pippin, which I think completes the collection. That's another part of the orchard, and just a young tree that we've only recently sourced. So what we've been doing over the last few years for these trees is growing them, exploring their uses, finding ways to market them to people, but also we've been grafting from them. So for example, there's some nice growth here. You can see that's last year's growth. This bit of growth here has grown this year. So the recent rain has helped this tree to put on some good healthy growth here. At the end of the year, around December or January, I can remove this bit of growth here and use this to graft this onto some rootstock to make another Charlestown pippin tree. And that's what we've been doing, is grafting from these trees and then pass them on to other projects, selling a few, but mainly using them to develop other community gardens, because we know that they grow well in this region, so they're a good choice. Right, we're at the top of the orchard now. This top row we were donated right at the start of us beginning to restore these gardens in 2004. So these were planted winter 2004-2005. They were donated to us by the Hollow Car Gardens Northern Fruit Group at the time. They were labelled, they were all interesting varieties. This variety was supposed to be something very rare and very interesting. Hargreaves Green Sweet, I think it was. And when it came to it, when the first fruits appeared on it, they tasted disgusting. I looked up in the reference again about it, and it insisted it was a good dessert apple. So I inspected further down the trunk and realised that what had happened was, what they'd given us was a plant where the graft had failed, and what was growing was just rootstock. So that being the root system and bit of trunk that you graft a variety onto to control its vigour and size, its speed at which it goes into production, and its disease resistance. But rootstock produces very uninteresting apples. So after all those years, we realised that the fruit was no good. It wasn't the variety it was purporting to be. We did what was called reworking it. So what I've done here is chop off all the branches of the tree as it was, and I just made a slit down into the bark and put some little bits of scion wood, like a 4 or 5 inch piece of wood from a variety that we really like. This example is Red Devil. Red Devil is a 1970s Kentish variety that produces very, very good quality fruit and does do quite well here. So we get demand for that, and we don't grow enough of it. So I thought, all right, we'll turn this tree into another Red Devil. And so what you can see here is reworking a bit of sandwood into just underneath the bark of these cut off branches. And sure enough, they've taken. So we've now got a tree which is Red Devil along here. You can see where the cuts were of the old tree. It's kind of ugly, but I kind of like it because we've repurposed it into something that's actually useful. And then since we liked that, two other trees along here that we didn't like, they were quite common cooker varieties which we just can't market. People don't buy cooking apples anymore very much. So we've chopped this one down completely here, and we've grafted on Ashmead's Kernel, which is probably the best tasting russet variety out there. I can't understand why you don't get it in the shops. You only get Egremont russet as a russet in the shops, which is a very nice apple, but I have to say that the Ashmead's Kernel is even better. Maybe on a commercial scale it doesn't perform well, but it does well for us. It's a very popular fruit, so you can see how well the grafts have taken here. They've grown new wood even all the way round the wound now, and they've got good sturdy graft onto the trunk there. And so this will be summer prune quite soon because there's a bit too much of it, so we'll thin it out a little bit very soon. And then one more along here in a different way. So cut off the top there, didn't take on that side, it's taken on those two sides there, which presents a pruning challenge, but this has got green balsam on it, which is one of the Yorkshire varieties which we found very popular with people. It's got a very lovely, sweet, honeyed flavour, even though it's a very dark green skin, even when it's ripe. It's dark green with like a little peachy blush on one side. And that tells you it's ripe and ready to eat. And so that one's so popular that we've got rid of the cooking apple on this tree and made it into a Yorkshire Heritage dessert apple instead. And that's doing quite well. You can still see the rootstock trying to produce more shoots along here. These just get literally just pulled off like that to make sure all the energy now goes into the tops of these trees. And then also at the top of this garden we've got a range of other varieties of apple. There's about 45 different varieties here, about 50 trees. They're mainly on semi-dwarfing rootstock like M26 or slightly larger dwarfing rootstock MM106. Which suits the scale of here. We've got ducks and geese running around under here, keeping the ground grazed to an extent, keeping some of the pests down. And that's pretty much mature now and should be good for the next sort of 10-20 years of production. And then you'd have to rethink what you're doing, but at the moment they're all doing pretty well. We've got other fruit in the garden. We've got plums elsewhere. We've got more espaliers. We've got a north-west facing wall border as well, where we have things like Morello cherries and other plums. So maybe another time we'll show you some of that as well.